All right, so I'm happy to be here to talk to you about some of the results that we've recently acquired here at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And what I really want to tell you about is the new ways that we're thinking about doing practical simulations for quantum chemistry on quantum computers. So what do I mean by practical? I sort of mean that in the near term, I can run this algorithm exactly as it's written down on the quantum device in the lab today. And I would contrast this with some algorithms that perhaps you have to pre-compile before you get on the algorithm or on the device, or make other modifications that you might need. And I really want to stress that this effort is a small part of the growing team here at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and the campus that we call the Advanced Quantum Enabled Simulation, or AQUIUS team. And you're going to hear more about that in the next talk. This team covers many different architectures, including ions and neutral atoms, as well as the superconducting qubit results you'll hear about today, as well as many applications that we consider important, such as things in quantum chemistry or theoretical physics. And I'm specifically going to focus on particulars that are related to quantum chemistry because that's my area of expertise. And I think it's an area of a lot of growing interest in the field, particularly in this kind of post-supremacy chasm that was discussed yesterday by Hartmut and others. For many reasons that you'll see today, some of these algorithms are perhaps a little bit more robust to errors than others, which makes them somewhat promising for near-term applications and ultimately makes them very interesting from a long-term standpoint as well, as you'll hear about. So why quantum chemistry? So many people here might not have a background in quantum chemistry or even know what that is. So quantum chemistry, to put it loosely, is some dream that if you give me a particular set of nuclei or atomic positions, and you want to know something about those atomic positions. So maybe you got that structure from an X-ray diffraction experiment. Maybe you just guessed what it might be. And just from that structure, I would like to determine many of the properties of this system. So for example, I'd like to know how it absorbs light on some spectra, maybe in whatever range. I'd like to know how different species complex within complex biological environments. And maybe I'd like to know how molecules interact with the surface. And from that understanding, I would like to develop some degree of control. If I know exactly how molecules absorb light, I can start to examine what functional groups might have influenced that, and I can use that to design new photovoltaics. If I know why things fold and complex in biological environments, perhaps I can prevent the misfolding of proteins that cause some diseases such as Alzheimer's. And if I know how things interact with surfaces, perhaps I can start to design new catalysts and get platinum out of our catalytic converters. And you might say that, wow, this sounds like a very grand dream that you have. How do you even hope to start accomplishing this? And quantum chemistry is also interesting in this regard, in that this problem is in some quirky sense already solved. So it was a quote by famous physicist Paul Dirac that the underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory of a large part of physics and the whole of chemistry are thus completely known, and the difficulty is only that the exact application of these laws lead to equations much too complicated to be soluble. And in fact, if you looked at these equations, they look fairly innocuous in this form. The time-dependent Schrodinger equation, in some very simple way, you map a molecule that you're interested in, such as benzene over here, into this linear eigenvalue problem. What I'm telling you is, if you could solve this linear eigenvalue problem, you would be able to gain all the understanding that I just talked about on the previous slide and perhaps be able to leverage that for some type of control in the future. So what is the difficulty in solving this problem? So it's one that's all too familiar to everyone in this room. So it's that if you actually try to write these equations down, so if you imagine taking this complex interacting system of electrons, solving it numerically, say putting it on a grid, then the dimension of this problem for a single particle grows like the number of grid points. And roughly speaking, without anti-symmetry, you add another particle, it grows like m squared, and very quickly you grow exponentially. So if you even, roughly speaking, only have 80 electrons in some grid of 100 different orbitals, we'll call them, which, to give you a chemical feel for this, which is really why I wanted to show you what this translated to, is a molecule of roughly this size, you would be talking about a linear eigenvalue problem that has a dimension of the universe squared. So if every particle in the universe had its own universe within it, I would need to solve that eigenvalue problem to get out the answer that I'm interested in. So clearly this is impractical, but for example, this is the type of difficulty that we want to turn into our weapon in quantum computing. the same idea that we want to leverage this space. We want to use the natural ability of quantum devices to explore this to get the answers that we're really interested in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we solve these problems classically, because it's important in a lot of ways, in the sense that we're going to leverage all of our classical knowledge to do the best that we possibly can on quantum devices. And also, this is how we're going to inform the inputs to our quantum computer. So how do we solve these problems? So the first thing we do, as I talked about, we need to represent this problem numerically somehow. So what we're looking at is this field of interacting electrons. We always take the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, or quite often. So our nuclei are just these background charges, and we're going to discretize the electron on some set of grid points. You can just think of them in the abstract that way, but know that we use specialized basis functions that have been refined, I would say, over the last century or so in quantum chemistry of trying to get very compact, very compelling representations of these things. We then use that to sort of write down the interacting problem in this basis set. So these functions here are just the basis set, and these are just the kinetic and potential energy, and of course the electron-electron interaction. Once we have that and we include the antisymmetry of the electrons, we have the specification of the problem we'd like to solve. So this is the central problem that I'll be talking about essentially for this entire talk. I'd like the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this particular operator. So now I've just written it down, and these HPQRSs and HPQ will be inputs to my quantum algorithm later. But this problem is still exponentially hard. So classically, what do people do? They make a simple assumption that perhaps the electrons don't interact so strongly. So as a first step, you often perform what's called a Hartree-Fock calculation. And physically, what this means is I freeze one of the electrons, I smear out the rest of them, and I ask where would that one electron like to sit the most. And I iterate this procedure over and over again until I get some set of approximately best single particle orbitals. And we often term these as molecular orbitals, and you'll recognize them from some introductory chemistry class, the last time you've taken one, as what you wrote down in these diagrams that you might not have paid attention to or cared too much about. But they predicted interesting things like the degree of strength of bonding or para-diamagnetism in certain diatomics, and they're a very convenient theory. Unfortunately, while they're simple, they're often not good enough. So if you had actually done the numerics for that simple H2 molecule you did in your intro chem class, and you took that molecule and you pulled it apart, and you examined what the energy looked like, you would have found that, in contrary to the exact answer which we have down here, you would have predicted something like the dashed line. And the reason you would have done that is because you're approximating these correlated electrons by a product state. There's no entanglement in this simple mean field picture, and that entanglement is crucial when electrons care a lot about where the other one is. So classically, how do we go beyond this idea of the mean field? Well, the simplest way, conceptually, though perhaps not computationally, is to simply enumerate every last state in the space that I talked about, this exponentially large Hilbert space. And pictorially, we often do this by starting from our molecular orbitals, which we call occupied, and the unoccupied virtual. And we simply enumerate every last one of these excitations. And we diagonalize in this basis, looking for these values of C's, which end up composing this tensor, which is of the size of the universe squared or larger, as I talked about earlier. So it's really this object we'd like to get at. But as I'd like to emphasize here, the key of quantum computing is that we can perhaps perform samples from this object that we're interested in without ever constructing it explicitly. I can focus on the quantities I'm interested in without getting all of the waste around it. And so, of course, there are many different classical methods which have been designed to attack this same problem. And I'd list just a few of them here, which many of you are probably familiar with, such as density functional theory or coupled cluster. And many of them have different properties, such as they're either more accurate or scale better. And what I want to do by showing you this is kind of say that, there's both a positive aspect and a challenge aspect to having all of this standards to stand upon. The positive aspect is that we have all this knowledge of tips and tricks that we can leverage for our quantum algorithms. The challenge is that in order to do something useful, we need to outperform 100 years of valiant effort by very, very smart people. And we're really aiming not just to perform some toy demonstration. We're really aiming to do something very interesting and applicable. And I'll highlight some cases that we really want to reach in the long term towards the end of this, but it really pushes our limits because we need not just to do some computation it's difficult to reproduce to some precision. We need to beat all of the best approximation methods that are available. And we need to do that for sizes of systems that are considerable. So it was first back in 2005 that Alon Asperuguzik and Martin Head Gordon, who's here, talked about one possible way you could do this. And it was using the quantum phase estimation algorithm, which I won't describe in detail here, but the general idea is if you can prepare some state with a reasonable overlap with the ground state, you evolve under the Hamiltonian that I'd written down earlier of your system, and you evolve perhaps to high powers of it and do a measurement at the end. You project yourself into an eigenstate of interest, and you can measure out that energy. And it seems that for a lot of instances, this scales polynomially, unlike this enormous exponential object that we had before. So there was a lot of interest in this because quantum chemistry is a problem where you have a lot of good applications, and this seemed to be an exponential separation between what you could do quantum mechanically and what you could do classically. So of course, people started to implement early experimental implementations of these ideas, but unfortunately, to get them on devices, you often had to do things like compile these unitaries down classically beforehand. And so these long coherent sequences, which often ranged in the order of millions or billions of gates for simple systems, were just totally untenable on the devices that you had today. And if you ask yourself what you'd really like to get out of doing a simulation, say on 5, 10, 20 qubits, in a case where you can diagonalize classically, you'd like to learn about the algorithm as the algorithm is actually written. So you learn how the noise affects it. You learn how different measurements might change the way that you consider your algorithm or design it. And so you wanted an algorithm that you could not only implement on the device, but implement faithfully. And so to do this, we wanted to change our perspective. So we thought about a new way in terms of co-design. So instead of given a task, design me the asymptotically optimal quantum algorithm in terms of factors of n, and then try to plug it into my quantum blue gene Q, and if it fits, then perhaps I get out the answer to life and everything. But if it doesn't fit, then I might end up getting nothing. So the solution to this, or one alternative at least, is given a task and the architecture, give me the best solution I can possibly get. And that might mean that you don't get the perfect answer, but for things like chemistry, where you're often asking coarse questions like, did this reaction happen or not, or what is the color of this particular object, then this might be a suitable way to go, and it might give you answers better than you could ever achieve classically. And really, it depends on this loop of coupling together this question and the available architecture and kind of iterating with the circuit to see how can I do this, what is the device capable of, and what can I do today and learn about this algorithm. And we showed our first demonstration, which I'll talk about back in 2014, on a photonics device that I'll talk a little bit about. So how do you actually take a quantum device and do everything that you can with it? So to do this, we wanted to identify tasks that were easy for a quantum device and really say, where are we going to get this speed up that we're interested in and still be able to do it? So just about one of the simplest tasks you could imagine, if you want to call your device a quantum computer, you'd best be able to measure the values of at least a single qubit repeatedly. So you'd like to take some average in the computational basis, ask a single qubit upon repeated preparation of some state, are you a 0 or are you 1? You'd also be able to ask this of some correlated measurements. Not all of them, a restricted set of these measurements. And it turns out this is efficient to prepare on any prepared quantum state, and it may be very hard to calculate this expectation value classically because of the exponential number of configurations. So we want to use this to do our particular problem. And how do I get our particular problem that I described to you at the beginning in terms of Pauli operators? So we started out in this basis of electrons, which are fermions, indistinguishable and antisymmetric. And we need to get over to this basis of qubits, which are distinguishable. So there are now a wealth of transformations. In fact, I think it's been proven there's an infinite number of interesting transformations to do this. And I'm just going to highlight one, which is the Jordan-Wigner transformation. So if you're not too familiar with this, literally what we're going to do in our case is take each of these AI dagger AJs that was in our original Hamiltonian, and we're just going to programmatically replace these. And you can do this offline fairly quickly on a computer, and what you're going to get out is just some Hamiltonian that's a sum of Pauli operators. And the important fact here is that the number of terms is preserved up to a constant factor. So even though you may get some non-local Hamiltonian terms in there, what you're going to have is only at most n to the 4 of these terms, so there's still going to be a polynomial number. You haven't acquired some horrendous overhead from doing this. And now that your Hamiltonian is in the language of qubits, how do I put it on a quantum computer? So if I go back to the basics and ask, how can I formulate eigenvalue problems? Then one way to do so is specifically for the ground state to formulate it as a minimization over some space or set of states. And if I want to minimize it over some set of states, and my Hamiltonian is decomposed as this sum of Pauli operators, where these coefficients are derived from those coefficients I showed you before. These are classical inputs to the problem that we've taken. And then just by linearity, this expectation value is the weighted sum of all of those repeated measurements that I talked about, of which there are only a polynomial number. And so we have two tasks here, one of which is easy for a quantum computer, sort of by assertion. I said that this quantum computer should be able to do this. And we have a task that's easy for a classical computer, which is that after I've done all these measurements, I can quickly sum these on perhaps a laptop or a supercomputer if I needed to. So why would I waste coherent operations on something that can be trivially done on a device that I have? And this really, it speaks to a hybrid scheme. And it says that if I can parameterize my quantum state with classical experimental parameters, and I can compute averages with the quantum computer, then I should couple these two things together and make some kind of hybrid quantum classical loop. And remember that once I've parameterized my system, so what I want to show here is that this idea is going to be pictorially represented as I feed in some state. I'm going to parameterize it in some way. Say these are going to be beam splitter angles on a photonic apparatus or pulse lengths on a superconducting qubit device. That's going to determine the state that I prepare. I'm going to feed it into this QPU, or quantum processing unit. It's going to perform those averages for me. These averages are going to come out as an energy, and I'm going to use my CPU to decide on some nonlinear minimization feedback step. This feedback step will give me a new set of experimental parameters for my next state. And I'm going to iterate this until I reach that minimum in energy that I'm interested in. And I don't show this particular experiment very often anymore because it was done some time ago. Started 17 minutes. Yeah. But this particular experiment that I don't show too often anymore is a photonics experiment that was done in collaboration with the University of Bristol, and it was the first realization we did of this variational quantum eigensolver. Our parameters were these beam splitter angles, and we did this feedback loop of guess a beam splitter angle, evaluate the energy, loop back, and update this set of parameters. And what you're shown here is the energy as a function of atomic separation, that is, as you pull the two atomic pieces apart. And these calculations are interesting to us because they tell us something about the strength of bonds in our system and how they might dissociate. And the reason I show that today is I want to emphasize later in this talk how far we've come in 2 years, both in terms of algorithms and in terms of accuracy. And so by doing this particular thing, we've really put the onus of this algorithm into the quantum state, into its parameterization. And the advantage experimentally of this is that the coherence time requirements are set by the device and not by the algorithm. That means you give me the device, you tell me what you're capable of, and now I'm going to do the best that I can within that set of constraints. And while that's very interesting, we also do some theoretical work in terms of unitary coupled cluster and adiabatic state preparation for cases where you can start in particular ansatz that are guaranteed to work theoretically, and this gives you a footing on which to do these types of different experiments. But I'm going to focus today more on the experimental parameterization side for our purposes. And I'm going to quickly highlight the fact that it was conjectured that this particular type of feedback algorithm, so while we're doing this up-to-date on-the-fly algorithm, so you imagine if my parameter was some rotation angle, but my experiment performed a coherent over-rotation each time I did it, then this classical feedback that's doing a minimization based on that angle doesn't really care about the labeling of the angle, and it can naturally find this coherent error and correct it. So we conjectured that certain types of coherent control errors would be corrected automatically by this algorithm. So it's kind of like a gate tune-up on the fly that happens all the time in the algorithm. And recently we did an experiment in collaboration with the Google group that showed this type of coherent error correction. And so this meshed with many people's intuition. But what I'm going to show you next, I guess, meshed with less people's intuition, which is there a modification of this algorithm that allows you to correct incoherent errors as well. So the way that we came about this was that all the experiments thus far had been done on the ground state for this algorithm. But there are many things in chemistry for which you'd like to know how to go beyond the ground state. For example, how does this molecule absorb light? How does it interact on non-adiabatic surfaces? And many other questions like this that are important. And we borrowed ideas from classical computation, which is that we wanted to express this Hamiltonian in some basis that roughly represented excitations away from a ground state. So what we do here is we build an offline representation of the Hamiltonian by perturbing the state with these excitation operators that just end up being Pauli operators. So we actually don't have to do any more coherent operations. We modify the Hamiltonian, and this gives us a polynomial set of extra operators to do. We build an offline Hamiltonian, an overlap matrix, and we solve, again, a quantum classical problem when we solve our generalized eigenvalue problem. And what happens is that we get approximate excited state energies and properties. And what was surprising to us is that when we tried this with simple noise models, we actually were able, with this extra information from measurements done at the end of the experiment, we were able to mitigate noise as well. So these are the forms of the operators that we actually measure. We Jordan-Wigner them, transform them first to get them to Paulis. But the surprising fact was that if you take this exact curve here and you compare it to a curve which is optimally configured under some amplitude and phase damping channel, then we predict a dramatic reduction in the energy, which corresponds to an increase in the quality of our solution by the variational principle. So from this, we had a prediction that we were going to both get excited states and reduce noise that was related to incoherent errors rather than coherent over-rotations. And so we'd conjectured about this for a while, and many people said, perhaps the noise model's too simplistic. I'll believe it when I see it in an experiment, things like this. And now we're happy to say that we have some preliminary data that will be coming out soon that showed that this, in fact, does happen. So this is just a highlight of the team that did this 2-qubit experiment here, for which the data I'm showing you. So this is a dissociation curve of H2, and we've highlighted down here the errors that are associated with each point. So in blue, we have the ability to sort of scan the entire parameter range of the device in this case. We can represent the optimal possible answer without this particular correction in blue here. And once we apply this linear response correction, then we can bring the error down dramatically within this blue window that's sometimes called chemical accuracy, which is the accuracy threshold required to get rates in chemical reactions right to an order of magnitude. So based on the fact that we could explore the entire parametric space, we can't really have, in the last problem sense, these coherent errors left in the sense that we've explored every possible state, but the errors drop dramatically. And we believe this is a signature of this correction of our theoretical prediction to incoherent errors. What's more, if we modify our procedure a little bit, we, in fact, get the excited states as well, and we get them to a very high degree of accuracy, much higher than we've seen in previous experiments in many cases. And to contrast the ground state curve with what we saw in 2014, you'll see that it essentially looks like we just traced the theoretical value exactly. So I wanted to highlight the fact that in just 2 years, both the experiments and the algorithms for doing practical computations have really come a long way, and I'm really excited for how this can push us forward. Just to show you one more molecule, we can also do lithium hydride. So to finish, I wanted to highlight for you where we want to go with these algorithms. What is the ultimate dream of what is our target with a quantum computer? So you may have heard of this particular reaction. So it's called nitrogen fixation, and it's used to produce ammonia that fertilizes crops around the world. So basically, all of our plant production, all of our food production depends very critically on this process throughout the entire world. The process by which we do it is called the Haber process. It happens at 400 degrees Celsius and 200 times atmospheric pressure, consumes 1 to 2% of the energy on the entire Earth. And in nature, we have this counterpart called nitrogenase. This small enzyme is able somehow to do at room temperature and atmospheric pressure what takes us so much energy. And we'd like to study how this actually happens so we could think about producing synthetic analogs. Remember that understanding to control step. Unfortunately, it's beyond all current classical methods. We don't even know where the nitrogen attaches within this active site. But we think with quantum devices that we could get a good representation of this active site with 150 to 200 logical qubits. And this is the big problems of the sort that we really want to push forward and tackle eventually with these devices. And just to kind of summarize, I want to reemphasize that we're looking at real big practical problems, that this quantum classical coupling with superconducting qubit devices has really pushed forward our accuracy and the problems we can handle. And I hope that you were compelled by this argument that we had for how we correct incoherent errors as well. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone that helped make this work possible and all of you for listening. Thanks a lot. So this is a point that we've been, so I guess I should repeat the question for the recording. But so the question was, how do we get the optimization to work on our feedback loop, given that many of our measurements are noisy? So this is a problem we've been working on for a little while. So there are some optimization techniques which are built for stochastic objective functions. And we're trying to incorporate more of those in these cases. For the current plots, we use a technique to kind of scan the surface and simply converge the values of our estimations low enough that it's not a problem. But actually, we're working on a paper now where we really delve into the details of how to get that accuracy down or up much, much faster and how to deal with that in optimization. And you're right that there's a lot of nuances, especially with regards to termination of the algorithm. Neldermead is tolerant of noise more so than gradient algorithms, but it is actually very poor for noisy objective functions in practice. Yeah, so it's a good question. So the question was, how do we think this is going to scale with the number of variables when we go to something like a 200-qubit system? And so I guess the answer to that is that we're going to try to lean on classical knowledge of chemistry quite a bit in this regard. And that the success of classical ansatzes that have used on the order of 1 billion parameters like MCSCF was that you have very good guesses, very good perturbative theories that can help bootstrap you up from things. I think if you tried to start from, say, a random guess and do just anything, you would almost certainly fail. But we would like to leverage things like adiabatic continuation. So maybe there are configurations which are easier to solve, which are close to mean field states, and you can slowly deform your configuration until you reach that. So the short answer to your question is we have some ideas for strategies, but we can't be positive exactly how they'll converge until we are able to get there. So the question was, is the scaling of these types of algorithms completely resolved or not? And like, how does this compare to things that are known to be in BQP, like quantum Fourier transforms and things like this? And the answer to that is, I think the general case is resolved in the sense that we know for worst case scenarios that initial states are going to be very hard to prepare and that some ground states just are difficult states to prepare. So K-local Hamiltonians are generically QMA complete, right? But there is this other argument that says for average cases over interesting sets of molecules, which is to say, or interesting sets of instances, which is to say perhaps things the universe actually prepared and prepared in great quantity, that these might not fall within that worst case umbrella. And so I would say that the average case complexity of chemistry is still an outstanding question. And the way this manifests within the two different algorithms in phase estimation is the difficulty of state preparation, and in variational quantum eigensolver, it's the difficulty of optimization. So I think there's still a lot of outstanding questions, but our hope is to proceed empirically and practically as it has been done historically in chemistry, which is that we have benchmarks for experiment by which to compare, and we're going to push and push and push and try to do better than that without kind of worrying too much that there exist instances which might be very difficult. So in this, this last part of the errors, this is actually a new feature we're trying to understand better of this way that we sample these excited states and these expanded spaces. And essentially, if the operators that you explore around your particular state correspond to the incoherent errors that you have in your system, then you can perfectly resolve these and kind of tell the difference between a statistical and a coherent superposition between two things. If it doesn't encompass that, the algorithm can confuse this statistical correlation for a coupling between two states. And so this causes a slight jump in the energy. We're still working on fully analyzing that and getting the details.